so I have to toggle between my slides and the Teams window to see what's going on. So if you can just let me know if the slides disappear, for example, because I can't see that they're disappearing. And then also if you have any questions or if you put anything in the chat, I think just let me know during this when you do it so that because I can't always see that that's happening. Okay. And I'm not sure why it's doing this, but but it's just there's a setting somewhere and I can't find where it is, which is causing this to happen. So can you see my slide now?
Yes, Doctor, we're seeing the covering of the slide.
Okay. So you're lucky because I can't. So okay. All right. So that's great. Okay. So if the slides disappear, just let me know because as I say, I can't see. I'm not seeing the same image that you're seeing in the Teams, and I'm really not sure why. It's just very strange. All right. So today we're going to be talking about. We're continuing with supervision of the early phase of supervision of quantitative research. Just to recap from session 1, we covered the philosophy of research, and particularly noting that certain philosophies are relevant for quantitative research. So if your student is going to be doing quantitative research, they should be sort of framing their study within a post-positivist framework and using a realist or critical realist ontology and an objectivist epistemology. If they're using words like interpretivism or subjectivism, they're in the qualitative domain, and that's the wrong kind of philosophy to be. It's not the wrong kind of philosophy, but you shouldn't really be using that kind of philosophy in the quantitative domain. I have shared the slides from contact session 1 with the course administration, so they should be available soon. I've also looked for I've got some proposals for you, which I'll share by Monday for assignment 1. I'm also going to provide you with some examples of how to use the desiderata from Anderson Daniels for reviewing proposals. I've also got some additional readings for you. So, for example, for the session today, I've got a more current reading on just distinguishing between conceptual and theoretical frameworks. And then we also still need to activate units 2 and 3 and assignments 2 and 3, but they'll be active by next week. All right, then, so those are some of the things that I still need to do from my side. So today we're going to start with conceptualizing a problem. So what are some of the key components that you need to worry about when you're conceptualizing a problem for a study? We're also going to go through conceptual and theoretical frameworks, and then we're also going to talk about theoretical propositions, which are very important for quantitative research. We're going to have a break, and then we're going to talk about research methodology. So let's see how far we get. And then, so we're shifting from the conceptualization of the problem in terms of what the problem is and the concepts that we're going to be working with. And then we're going to sort of ask the question, what kind of methodology can we use to investigate that problem in a quantitative context? All right. So just so 2 people, Theodora and Andre, you weren't here. Sorry, you were here, but you're having trouble with communication. So can you I just need to know a little bit more about you, and also so that the group can learn a bit more about you. So can you just tell us your name, your discipline, what area of research you focus on, what kind of experience you have doing quantitative research, and if you think about your past or current supervisor, what is one positive lesson you learned from them? So can you just do a quick introduction of yourself? Let's start. Theodora, can you start? Yeah.
Good morning, Doctor. Good morning, everybody. My name is Theodora Ratifola, and my discipline, I'm from the Faculty of Nursing. I have just been conferred as a doctor on the 2nd of September. My interest is on medical health care, which was long called psychiatric faculty. And I am I'm a novice supervisor. I used to work at the nursing colleges, and I was facilitating research methodology with a little bit of teaching, teaching how to formulate a proposal. I was responsible for basic nursing students, which were legacy programs. And when we moved to higher education, where we are supposed to facilitate research for postgraduate students, I continued to teach research methodology with a little bit of supervision of projects and research projects. I was interested in this course because I want to see myself in a higher academic space. So I think I am well prepared now and well armed, having pursued my PhD, and very soon will be finishing this supervision course. And I'm also doing data analysis and coding, so that I am a perfect researcher. I don't know what to call myself, will be calling myself. Otherwise, I'm preparing for retirement, where I will be doing all these supervision, marking, and coding and data analysis for researchers. I am at the moment employed at the Nursing Council, South African Nursing Council, doing totally different responsibilities. I am moving all the provinces as a professional advisor, where we are looking at new applications for new programs, and whoever who is trying to put up a private nursing school for accreditation purposes. That is my line of duty. Otherwise, I am looking at moving away from these responsibilities to see myself, as I've alluded, in an academic space. I thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations, Theodora. Yeah, it's a big achievement to finish a PhD. Okay, so well done for that.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And what was your PhD? Was your PhD research a quantitative or a qualitative or a
It
mixed
was,
methods?
yeah, sorry to have not indicated that. Most all of my degrees were qualitative, so
Okay, yeah.
yeah, I don't have an idea of quantitative.
So
But
you've got
though my
totally
study, yeah, my study on phase 2 had a qualitative and quantitative, but
right.
it
Yeah.
was a little bit of it. Thank you.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. Andre?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Andre van der Westhuizen. I'm currently the head of education at a private higher education institution in Johannesburg on one of the campuses. I have been lecturing research methodology since 2019. And although we deliver the qualitative and the quantitative contents. It is at NQF7. It's final year Bachelor of Education students. I'm in the Faculty of Education. And I also supervise these sort of mini projects. I don't have any experience in conducting quantitative research myself or supervising quantitative projects. I'm very comfortable in the qualitative space, but I think I'm comfortable where I am now in my career to actually explore the quantitative methods a bit more to understand it better. And if I think of any feedback or experiences from past or current supervisors, there's one specific person from UKZN that I'm thinking about who supervised me, and the meticulous detail that I always received was just outstanding, and that I tried to use in my own space as well.
Great.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I do think what we learn or how we experience supervisors does influence how we then behave as supervisors as well, hopefully. Yeah. So great. Okay, thank you very much. Right, so I'm going to move on now. So today we're going to focus on conceptualizing a topic. So I was just thinking when I was preparing this that we should maybe have started with this, but it's sometimes quite tricky to work out exactly what sequencing to use for the for the for the sort of concepts and ideas that we kind of going through. But so this slide, the point of this slide is really to emphasize that when we're designing a research project, it's a sequence of links and chains, and a couple of points about this. So the slide shows the various components that we need to have a research project work. So, for example, you might have a theory or a point of view as part of your conceptualization of the problem. That leads to questions and models, and then you have a design, and then you have your subjects and situations. So that's your research is occurring within a context and so on. And then you collect data, do analysis, and then reach a conclusion, which then sort of links to the next study. Because often so we're going to be using previous research to develop our own research, and then the findings that we make from our study then link to new studies. And often when we do a study, we might encounter something which then leads to a gap, and when we use gaps to identify new research that we can do. But the key part about this diagram is that it's about the links in the chain. And if you have one weak link in the chain, it might make the chain break. So it's that sort of idea that all the components of your research design must be strong in order to, and when you action your research, the quality of the work that is done must be strong. Otherwise, the research might be seen to be weak, and not. Yeah. So it's about this idea that the links every link is important in the chain, and if you have a weak link in the chain, it can affect what comes after that. So it's just an idea, and it's partly to sort of also demonstrate the complexity of research, that we have to think about all these different components, and we have to do them all well. So it's just a sort of way of thinking about research in terms of there's a number of components involved, and we need those components to work together. And your work is as strong as the weakest link in the design. Okay, so today we're going to be focusing on some of the components in this diagram. So we talk about the topic, the problem statement, the research question. So when we're designing a piece of research, we decide on a topic. We draw on the literature to find the topic and to understand the topic. When we've got the topic, we then sort of develop a problem statement, and then from that problem statement, we derive research questions. So that's the kind of sequencing of the process of developing a research project. And then we also have a conceptual framework which we use to kind of explain what the research is about and how it's going to work. So we're going to talk about conceptual frameworks a bit later. So we're going to start. So and they're all interrelated. And so we're going to start with the topic, and then move on to the conceptual framework after looking at problem statements and research questions. And I'm going to give you some suggestions for how to develop those. So the last assignment that you do for the course is developing a sort of portfolio of tools that you can use to help students with quantitative research. So I'm going to give you some examples today which you might be able to use towards that portfolio. So always bear that in mind as we're going through the course. I'm going to be giving you different ideas about things that you might be able to use You might not find them useful. You might, we all have individual sort of preferences for what we might think is good and not good in terms of supporting students. But so I'm going to make some suggestions based on what I found to be useful, and then you can consider those for the final assignment. Okay, and I'll remind you about it as we go through the course. Okay, so the first thing the student needs to do is find a topic, and there's different suggestions. So the flow of the idea is that you come up with a topic, you then have then from that topic you develop a research problem and a purpose statement, and then you develop research questions. So that's the kind of general flow. And as you've done research yourself, you'll understand that that's the kind of process that we follow, whether you're doing a quantitative or a qualitative design. So this applies to both quantitative and qualitative. Okay, so so understanding the topic is something that so you, as a supervisor, you would need to help students understand that research is a process that demands imagination, creativity, discipline, and structure. So when they come to you for wanting a topic, or when they want to do a qualification, they're going to have to decide on a topic as part of that qualification. And the supervisor's role is to make it sort of to help the student understand that it's going to be a complex process. They're going to have to be disciplined and structured in doing research and so on. But there is also this element of creativity involved as well. The student would need to read more, and because literature provides us with the valuable information that we need in order to develop the topic. And the student needs to read for context as well as for academic purposes. So there's not just about because research occurs in particular context. So one of the reasons why we sometimes are concerned about literature being older is the context was different at that point in time, and so the context can change quite quickly. So it's not just about the academic content of the paper; it's also about it's not just about the academic themes raised in a piece of literature, for example. It's also about when that work was done and what was the context at that particular point in time, and is it different to now? Okay, like I've showed this figure in the last session. It just highlights the idea that when you're doing a study, there's two sources of literature that we need to use. One is the topic literature on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, there's the methodological literature, which can be part of the topic literature. So when you're studying in a particular topic,
sorry, doctor.
Yes,
yeah. Move the slide. We still at there you are.
Okay, sorry, it's just taking a while to react. Yeah, okay. So the methodological literature will often be part of the topic literature. So when you're focusing on a topic, if you're reading a research paper, that research paper will explain the methodology that was used if it's a primary data-based study. But there's also literature which is specific for methodology, which might not be directly related to a topic, but you can still use to. So if you want to know about case studies, for example, there's literature on case studies which might not be directly related to the topic, but it's still useful literature to use to explain how you're designing your methodology. So just the important point that there's different sources of literature. Okay, and then the student needs to narrow the topic. So one problem that all students have, and it's a problem that I had as a student as well, is when you start with a topic, it's always usually far too broad and far too large in scale to be practical to do. So it's this idea of finding the lifeboat on the Titanic. So you've got this massive ship, and then what you want to focus on is just a small component of that ship. If you've got a very large topic, it means that your literature review is going to be much more onerous, so much more literature to review. And I had that problem with my PhD. Just my own experience with my PhD was that I had too many themes going on and so on. So it was trying to bring that down into a more manageable focus. And then it's also good if you're supervising students to guide them to avoid general studies because they're difficult to carry out and difficult to interpret. So that it's again finding that narrowing the focus down to something which is more manageable and more measurable. And then the time of the time of narrowing down might differ depending on if you're doing a quantitative or a qualitative study. So usually with a quantitative study, you'll narrow down much earlier than if you're doing a qualitative study. So just by nature of the problem that you are looking at and the way those two different approaches or those different approaches work. Okay, so yeah, so quantitative is usually it usually involves a specific manageable topic from the start, from an earlier phase, except if you're me and you, yeah, so I don't quite fit into that. Yeah, I'm thinking about my PhD topic, which was, as I say, it was very broad. So it wasn't focused in the beginning. And then qualitative is likely to be more general at first, and then after some observation, the topic will be narrowed down. So how do you get this topic? How do you narrow down the topic? You can have advisors or supervisors guiding the student in terms of how to bring down the focus. You can consult with specialists in the field to get their input on what would make a more manageable project. You can look at overviews of the status of the topic. So that would involve reading the literature and seeing where what areas have been covered well, what specific areas or focuses need more attention. And that usually the overviews and the reviews would have guidance in terms of being able to bring down the topic into a more manageable project. And then also handbooks, special issues and reviews. So basically literature and reports, research reports and so on would help the student bring down the focus. I'm also going to give you a sort of a practical example of that from a reference now. Okay, so this is from a book by Blackster. I can't remember, it's a book about starting a research project, I think, and it's choosing a research topic. And 10 ways a student can think of a research topic would be to ask your supervisor, manager, friends, colleagues, customers, clients, or your mother. That's yeah, so depending on what kind of field you're working in. Looking at previous research work, so that's examining previous research work and looking for the gaps usually when researchers write a paper, they'll conclude by saying further research is needed in this area. And that's where you can identify areas for new research or extend the existing research project. You can develop some of your previous research or your practice at work. So in the projects that we supported at StatCon at UJ, sometimes a master's student or a PhD student might be doing research that they started in their honors or their master's degree. Or a person they might have observed something at work and then they decide to investigate that problem that they've noticed at work, for example. So they see a sort of problem in the work environment and then they investigate that as a research project. You can relate it to your other interests. So if you've got interest in a particular area, you can then develop a topic based on that. You can think of a title. You can start with a quote that engages you. You can just follow your hunches. These are not such clear cut. These are a bit more sort of broad than the asking a supervisor. You can draw yourself a picture or a diagram. You can just start anywhere, which is not a good idea probably. And then, but if you're desperate, that's probably an option. And then the last point is be prepared to change direction, because you might not be able to do the sort of work on the topic that you originally think that you might be able to work on. So just a quick question. I mean, how did you come about your topic for your most recent degree? Let's hear from you. How did you um, how did you come about the topic that you started for your last degree, your most recent degree?
Okay, let me just try and explain how I came to wanting to develop. My title was Development of a Psycho-Educational Program to support family members living with youth using substance abuse. I consulted my supervisor to come to concluding that we will develop a program. From my previous study, which was experiences of family members living with youth abusing substance abuse. So we needed to have something to support the family members, as the recommendations were, as findings were showed that they were depressed and they had anxiety, they have all those mental disorders due to experiences they whilst living with these young abusers. So we had to do something to support the family. So we decided that it should be the recommendation from the previous studies showed that there is a lack of knowledge about substances. There is a need for social and psychological support. So we thought of doing something that came as a program that needed to support those. And then it was referred, we came to a consensus with my researcher, my supervisor, that it should be coming into a program that it was integrated into social, psychological, and educational. I think it's understandable. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, good. Okay. So it was partly based on your experience and then partly what you observed to be going on, and then partly based on then discussing with your supervisor about whether that was a sort of a suitable kind of project to work on. Yeah, yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
yes, thank
Yeah.
you.
Mfundo?
Thank you, Doc. My research topic, I think your question is how I came up with the topic for my previous degrees. I'll start because I started at BTech. When I was doing my BTech, I was already in the media industry, and I could see a slightly decline in terms of advertising, particularly with newspaper industries and commercial or community newspapers. So when we were given a research methodology module, I was interested more in terms of the strategies that the owners of media houses or the publishing editors, because most of the community newspapers are owned by the publishing editors. I wanted to know the strategies that are going to put in place since digital media is overtaking traditional media. So I was looking at the influence. I was looking at how marketing or public relations officers in the community media space are appropriating digital media to keep pace with the competitive environment. And I got a good mark. It was 90%. and that was very interesting. I still remember that highest mark in my BTech. Then in my honors, I focus on community radio stations, the producers, the role of producers in digital age in the community radio stations, considering that audience is no longer passive, is now the consumers. So they act as producers as well, because through Facebook, social media, and etc., they can produce whatever content they want. Producers used to gatekeep information for the audience, but now the audience, that gatekeep, that message, that information that producers they gatekeep, then audience, they can produce and publish it in their social media platforms without verifying. So which means I was also looking at disentangling this information in the community radio stations. Then at master's level, I was also interested in the use of social media in the community radio station, but I was actually confused what to do. Then my supervisor suggested that I read some book chapters that they've published about news, social media, disinformation, and artificial intelligence. Then I started reading. I came up with a topic that was changed at a later stage. As you said, we must be prepared to change the direction. So it completely changed from whatever that I wanted to do. Then in my master's, I looked at the appropriation of social media into news production processes in selected community radio station in the Eastern Cape. And I was looking at the sourcing of news, how journalists in the newsroom are appropriating or integrating social media or new media and technology in sourcing of information. In news production, I looked at editing, verification, and dealing with fake news. And in dissemination, I wanted to know how they convey news, how they broadcast news in digital age as to compare during traditional days of broadcasting. In my master's, I had I produced 2 book chapters, 1 article, journal article, then I also produced 1 conference proceeding. So I had 4 publications for my master's. Then in my second master's, since I've worked in education and I've got 10 years now working in higher learning of institution. So I was looking at how has e-learning and e-teaching policies, cultural practices, communities, and increased personal ownership of devices have influenced research in educational technologies. So in that one, I'm still in the process of converting my dissertation into publication as well. Then in my PhD that I'm starting next year, I am looking at how emerging scholars or researchers or lecturers in universities are preparing students for the real world through the use of artificial intelligence, especially in the media and communications discipline.
Great. Okay, thank you. Yeah, sure. So, okay, so congratulations on your very good mark and on your very productive masters. Yeah, okay. Good. Okay, so I think the key thing about your stories is that there's different ways you can come to a topic, and but as a supervisor, you need to sort of be able to guide your students if they're struggling to find a topic. Sometimes they will find one relatively easily, and then at other times they will they might struggle, and then that's where you need to step in and help them just to find, and then there might be suggestions of ways you can do it. So there's a book that I recommended in the last session. It's called sorry, I'm just Theodora, I'm just muting you. I'm sorry, I just can see your volume going on and off there. It's a very good publication called Designing Research for Publication. And there's a lot of practical suggestions in the book about how to sort of activities that you as the researcher could do, or you could recommend to a student to do, to help them at different phases of the research process. And one of the very good suggestions early on in the book is because the students are quite nervous about doing research if they haven't had much experience. So one way of kind of easing them into the process of doing the research is to get them to think about this idea that they're just joining a conversation, which is not, it's not that difficult to join a conversation. Some people might find it easier or more difficult. But then the student is then going to contribute to that conversation by the work that they're going to do. And then there's very specific, it's just not moving now. Yeah, so this is an exercise from Huff. How does a researcher find a promising conversation? So how do they find the topic essentially? You can define your current, and then the Huff lists steps that the student can follow to come up with an idea for their topic. So define your current project in a short abstract. That's the first point. Draw an initial bubble map of the conversations that might contribute to your project. So those conversations would come from the literature. So who's saying what about the topic? And then there's some examples of bubble maps in the chapter. I just need to make sure that I've given you this. And then evaluate each conversation in terms of the student's identity and trajectory as a scholar. So is it, as Mafuna was saying, or Theodora was saying, you have an interest in that particular area. So, and that's what's going to draw you to the research and going to make you stay in that research because you're interested in that particular topic. So this is the same kind of thing. If you're interested in that particular problem, you're more likely to spend energy and time working on the problem. And then make decisions that lead to a more focused conversational map. So you're going to get rid of some of those bubbles because some of the bubbles aren't that relevant for what you want to do. And then put a star on the one conversation that you think is the most promising to focus on. So it's basically you're kind of looking at a topic in a broader way, and then by sort of making these topics or subtopics which are discussed within the area. And then you'd sort of narrow down by using this process. So this is something that you could, if your student is struggling to find a topic, this is a tool that you might be able to use to help them narrow down the topic that they're using. And you could even try and use it yourself as an activity to see how well it works for you as a supervisor. Okay, and just remember, this is I'm using these kinds of examples to also help you towards that last assignment that if you think this is a really nice idea, that's something that you could put into that last assignment that you need to do for the course. Okay, and I'm going to be pushing that right the way through because, as I said, the courses are happening over quite a short period of time, and you need to be ready for that final assignment when it needs to be done on time, basically. Okay, so I'm pushing for for that. Okay, so as a supervisor, what do you consider as good topics and why? So when you're supervising, you do need to think about what could be a good topic for your student, and obviously topics must make a contribution to you want to make a contribution to society through the research that you're doing. So just as an example, at UJ, the focus more recently the current vice chancellor at UJ has a focus on the social benefits of research and the very different social economic benefits of research. So the I can't remember the thing, but so there's certain sustainable development goals. That's what I'm looking for. Sorry. So the current Vice Chancellor has a focus on sustainable development goals, and so there's a push for the research that people do, that researchers at UJ do, to have a focus on sustainable development. I think most research, my experience over time, is that most research would have that focus anyway. But that's partly because I've worked in development studies, and development studies is concerned with sustainable development goals. That's part of their it's a big focus in development studies. So if you had a topic, you want a topic which would be relevant to one of those goals. The previous Vice Chancellor was concerned about 4IR and the impact of 4IR on society and the growth of 4IR on society. So there was a focus at that point. And there still is at UJ, that we still are focusing on 4IR as well. But now with the added sustainable development goals. So those topics would be considered relevant because they're kind of dealing with contemporary issues, contemporary problems. So there's those are it's important as a supervisor to think of topics which are very relevant for the student for society as well, not just for the student or the university. So they need to be making a contribution to society. Okay, so once the student has a topic, they then need to come up with a problem statement. So you have to identify a problem, and you also need to make a purpose statement and include research questions in a proposal. So the research problem is the issue or the concern or the controversy which is going to be investigated in the study. The purpose is the intent or objective of the study. So they overlap with each other, but the one is identifying the problem. The other, to some extent, is saying how is the problem going to be resolved. Okay, so there we go. I'm going to just put that in. Okay, then so Creswell has an example of a problem statement and he gives an example in a chapter of a problem statement. And again, I must just make sure that you've got this. And then he gives advice. It's based on a social science model, but I think the same principles would apply for a science-based study as well. So his advice is to write an opening sentence that stimulates interest as well as conveys an issue to which broad readership can relate. And he gives an example of this in the chapter. So what I would suggest you do is read that chapter to see what the problem statement looks like. And then that's the kind of thing, again, that you could use as a guide for your student for how they can do their problem statements. Specify the problem dilemma leading to the study. So what's the problem which makes the study relevant? What issue establishes a strong rationale or need to conduct the study? Okay, so for example, in Joburg at the moment, there's a bit of a water issue. There are some communities that are protesting because they don't have water. So that would be a good starting point to say there's a problem here, and it's a very serious problem, and that could lead a researcher to investigate why there's water supply issues, and you could do a nice study looking at what the experiences of the people that don't have water supply regularly, and also investigate what the problems are within the supplier. What do they say the problems are, and so on. So it can be a very practical problem. It can also be a more theoretical problem. But if you're doing primary research, you need to collect data. It would usually be a more practical problem that you were focusing on. Then you need to indicate why the problem is important. And then importantly for a quantitative study, focus the problem statement on the key concept being tested quantitatively or explored qualitatively. So in a quantitative study, your key concept would be your dependent variable. And we'll look more variables later on. In a qualitative study, it's the central phenomenon of interest. So in a quantitative study, you're going to have independent and dependent variables usually, but in your problem statement, you're going to focus on the dependent variable. So it could be why is the water supply so irregular or not reliable? When you're looking at a problem of water supply, that would be your dependent variable. What is causing that water supply to be so unreliable? And then the independent variables would be things like poor management of the system and so on. Okay. Yeah, and then he also suggests don't use quotes in the lead sentence, but that's quite common in qualitative research. Researchers often will use a quote. And yeah, as I said, yeah, and then I've just read what I wrote in the next thing without realizing it was there. Okay. Then stay away from idiomatic expressions or trite phrases. So keep it academic. Consider numeric information for impact. So that's where you might say something like, 46% of the water and supply in Johannesburg is lost through leaks. That's a very big statistic and it's a very impactful statistic. And then also consider short sentences for impact. So don't have these long, tortuous sentences, which by the time the person gets to the end of the sentence, they've forgotten what the problem is. Okay, so that's the so that's the problem statement. So I think you should have that chapter from Creswell. So have a look at that as an example, and that's something that you could use again for students to get an idea of what they need to do. So Creswell he writes textbooks basically for research methods, and they're very good sources for very general. It's general. It's not. He doesn't write about specific disciplines. But he provides very nice general kind of advice for information that you could use across disciplines. So you could use this in nursing or in communication or various different disciplines. Okay, then you need to also think as a supervisor, what do you consider as a good research problem? Yes, sorry, Theodore, you have a question?
Before you go ahead, did you give us the title of this Creswell?
I think I can't remember. Okay, I'll have to look. Yeah, so I'll have to look at the it's a chapter from the book, and I can't remember specifically what the chapter's called, but I'll check just to make sure for you. Yeah. So just look for the reference so I've given you the date and the page number here, so you'll be able to find the reference. There will be a reference there with that date and if you find the right page numbers, you'll know it's the right reference. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, I see Andre has responded to that. Can you kindly share it on the chat box, please?
Have a look. Sorry. Where are we? Chat. Yeah, sorry, I've got to toggle between windows here. Yeah, so that's the research design, qualitative, quantitative. I don't know if the version that I had mixed methods in it, but yeah, so it's yeah. But just look for there should be a reference, Creswell 1994. And I think there's probably only one there. There might be two, but there's one because I also use another chapter from that book with the purpose statement. So there might be two there, but you can find it using the page numbers as well. So it should be 1994, and then the page. Just use the page numbers to find the correct chapter. Okay, but I also need to check that it's there because there's I haven't done a check to make sure that all the information that needs to be there is on the site. It should be, but I just need to double check that. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so just look for the Creswell 1994 and then pages 46 to 50. But I'll also check that it's there.
Okay, Dr. I'll do that. You can carry on.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. So, but in that chapter, he gives an actual example of a problem statement. So I'm just showing you the criteria that he suggests that it should contain, but he does give an example of one, which so you can read through it and see what the problem statement looks like. Obviously, every problem statement is going to be different because it's different topics and so on. But these are just general kind of guidelines for what a good problem statement should sort of look like, basically. Okay, so and again, as a supervisor, what would be a good research problem and why? Again, it's something that's manageable. So if you have when you're evaluating a student's research problem that they're coming up with, it must be something that's relevant and manageable. You don't want to have a sort of a research problem that's too vague or not actually practically researchable. It must be something that's researchable. So those are some of the things that you need to think about in terms of a research problem. But this is just to get you to think about if you're looking at a student's work and if you're looking at their research problem, what kinds of things would you need to think about to what sort of attributes or characteristics about that research problem would you need to think about? So yeah, is it a feasible kind of problem to investigate? That would be one of the things. Is it ethically sound? So does it have ethics implications depending on the kind of problem that you're doing? So I sit on I'm a sort of member of a ethics committee, and we often ask questions about, well, not often, but sometimes depending on the research topic, we will ask questions about, is this research relevant or meaningful in terms of the ethics, or is it crossing boundaries? Because yeah, so there was a controversial case with a social work project involving children, for example, where some of the members of the committee had some reservations about the kind of work that was being done. So that, and obviously, if you working, and then I think in the modern era with a lot of research taking place in social media space, there's questions about how researchers can use the information on social media. Is it ethical to use the information? And also approaching people using social media, is it ethical to do that? So there's lots of new kind of issues coming up with research because of the way, or because of the different sources of data we can use and so on. And we haven't actually we don't have a sort of full a sort of comprehensive set of guidelines for how to deal with these new ways of doing research in the social media space, for example. Right, so, and then there's a purpose statement. So a quantitative purpose statement, this is again from Creswell, but this is a new page number. So Theodora, look at the page numbers here. I think it's a separate chapter. So there's two chapters. One is on the problem statement, the other is on the purpose statement. So these are some of the characteristics that would go into a purpose statement. So, and then I'm going to give you a scripted example in the next slide. So this is use words such as purpose, intent, objective to begin the passage. So the objective of this research is to, or the purpose of this research is to identify the theory, model, or conceptual framework to be tested in the study. So that's in the purpose statement, you're going to indicate the theory, or if you are testing a theory, that should be included in the purpose statement. Mention the specific type of method of inquiry being used, because the purpose should indicate how it's going to be done, how the research is going to be done. State whether the independent and dependent variables will be related, or whether two or more groups as an independent variable will be compared in terms of the dependent variable. Order the variables in the relationship from independent to dependent. So if you're testing a relationship between variables, you start with the independent variable, and you say, although remember in your sorry, in your problem statement, you focus on the dependent variable because that's the most critical kind of component of the study in a quantitative study. When you're describing the link between the variables, you put the independent variable first because that's the variable which is going to influence the dependent variable. So for the purpose statement, you introduce the independent variable and indicate how it relates to the dependent variable. You also can refer to the unit of analysis in the study. So is it going to be, are you focusing on people? Are you focusing on households? Are you focusing on documents? What is the unit of analysis? And then provide a general definition for each key variable in the study and use established definitions. We'll talk about those a bit later as well. So those are some of the components that you would include in a quantitative purpose statement. And then this is a scripted purpose statement for quantitative studies. This is from the Creswell chapter as well. So what this is giving you is like a sort of an example of how you can derive a purpose statement and just fill in the information that's relevant or what's relevant for your particular study. So the purpose of the survey is to test the theory of, and then whatever theory you're measuring, independent, and then you mention the independent variable to the dependent variable for a group of subjects or the sample that you're focusing on at a given research site. The independent variables will be defined as, and then you give a general definition. The dependent variable will be defined as, and then you give a general definition of your dependent variable. And if you have any intervening variables, then you can mention what they will be and whether you're going to control for them in the study. So Creswell also, I think he also has a scripted purpose statement for a qualitative study as well, if memory serves correctly. But this is a nice example of how you can develop a purpose statement for your quantitative project. So it indicates the type of method that's going to be used. Is it going to be experimental or survey study or a case study even? You're indicating the theory that's going to be tested if there is a theory. You're indicating what the independent and dependent variables are. So it should be very clear from this purpose statement what the study is about. Okay, and this is a nice way of framing it. So the key things that you need to have included in a purpose statement are included here. So again, quite a nice thing to give to a student to use to help them, guide them in terms of developing their. And this you can see how this could be used for different disciplines because it's very generic, but you can put your information and you could use nursing information here. You could use education information here. You can use, it applies to different disciplines. What it doesn't actually sort of necessarily help with is if you've got something which is quite complicated. So this is quite a simple sort of design. If you've got something more complicated and lots of variables and things, then you might have to expand. You would have to expand the purpose statement to include that complexity. Okay. All right, and then the last component here is the research questions. So there is a resource that I'll share with you by Blakey called Research Questions and Objectives. It's a very good chapter on it's about how to frame research questions and so on. So that's a good chapter to look at. So I'm not going to go into detail about what's covered there, but have a look at that chapter as a resource as well. The one thing I think, one of the things that Blakey suggests is that your objectives, research questions, and hypotheses are interrelated. So they kind of reflect each other. So what that would indicate is that you don't necessarily need to have objectives and research questions and hypotheses in a proposal because the three things are quite closely interrelated. So your objectives, so I think particularly in a quantitative way, so usually your research questions are then converted into hypotheses for your, so it's not necessary to have all three of these things these three components in a proposal, but it might be that the discipline that you work in, and sometimes when you're putting in a proposal for a committee for reviewing, they might require those three things to be there. So it's not necessary that you might need all three, because they reflect each other, but it might be required that they're there. So it's just a comment about that. I wouldn't make a judgment that I think for me, if you've got objectives and questions, you probably don't need hypotheses, but it might be required within a particular discipline. Okay, so research questions are, it's very important to have good research questions, because they really drive the research. Everything centers around those research questions in terms of measurement, in terms of analysis, and so on. So we get descriptive and inferential questions. And then, so a descriptive question would be a question that sort of elicits information which describes a situation. And then inferential questions are questions which make links between variables, and from which you would infer relationships from that linkage between the variables.
Sorry, Doctor.
Yes,
to interject. The slide hasn't moved.
Okay, let me just try.
You said we must alert you, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. So what are you seeing now? Research questions.
Yeah, it has changed.
Sorry, it's changed now.
Yeah. It has changed, Doctor.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, thanks. Yeah. Okay, so, and then we have what, why, and how questions. So have a look at, I'll show you some examples of questions now, but, and then there's also quite a good story by, there's a book called Jennings, a book by Jennings on research methods. I think I've given you the chapter. Let's just check that it's there as well. And it's a apocryphal story. That means it's not necessarily a true story. It could be a made-up story of a doctoral student who was asking why sultanate was able to hold on to power. And then while the research was going on, the sultanate lost power. So the research question changed to why did the sultanate, why was the sultanate not able to hold on to power? So, and that's the key thing. It's the thing about research is that as you're going through the process, things can change, the context can change, lots of things can change while the research is going on. So you need to be flexible about your questions. And it also might be that when you do your research, something goes wrong, and then your original questions can't be answered. So you need to reframe the questions to be able to, so you might have data that you can use to answer some questions, but they're not the same questions that you started out with. So you need to be able to you need to be flexible in order to, and it's kind of sort of making sure that students' expectations are not that things are always going to work out perfectly. And then having a plan B if they don't, because what you need to avoid as a supervisor is students' projects kind of collapsing completely. You want to get something working from them. And that obviously, and that goes back to that original picture about the links in the chain. The links are important, and if some of the links break, then the whole chain might break. And it's, you don't want a situation where students have got very far down the line and then everything goes wrong. And the point here is with the research questions, you might need to change the questions because the results don't quite work out the way you're expecting them to. And the key thing is, not to lose the project because of that. Okay. So any project should have at least one research question. Quantitative projects normally have a number of research questions. Qualitative could have one big question. And it's also important to emphasize to students that your research questions are not the same as the questions that you might include in a questionnaire. Your questions and the questionnaire will contribute to answering the research questions, but they're not the research questions themselves. Usually you need a number of questions to answer a particular research question. And then, this is yeah, that's my alarm going off to remind me to take a break. So this is one of the examples of the chapter from Blakey, which is looking at the topic of student plagiarism. There's different topics that he uses as examples there. So the first question, what has been the extent of detected plagiarism over the past 5 years? That's a descriptive question. So it's just going to give you a number which says it's a certain percentage or a certain number of instances have been observed. What types of plagiarism are students engaged in? That's also a descriptive question. So I didn't know this, but with working with a colleague at an academic at UJ, there's lots of different categories of plagiarism. And then when we get to uh, uh, the question 5, for example, and question 6, that's where you get to the more inferential questions. What consequences does plagiarism have for students' intellectual development? So there you're making a link between the plagiarism and intellectual development of students. And then why do students plagiarize? That would also be a more inferential question, because you're looking for reasons for why plagiarism occurs. Is it because of they don't manage their time properly, for example? Is it because the content is too difficult? There's different there you're looking at the different explanations for plagiarism and looking at the relationship between those explaining factors and the type of plagiarism or the degree of plagiarism. So that chapter from Blakey is a very good chapter in terms of explaining what research questions are, how they work, and then also he's got a nice section on different questions that for different kinds of topics. It's mainly social science, but so if you're working in a social science education or nursing or communications, the questions would be useful for you. Okay. Not for necessarily for your specific topic, but as examples that you might be able to adapt for your topic area. Okay, I'm going to take a break now because I don't think I'm going to be able to finish this session today, looking at where we are. Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break, and then I want to move on to conceptual frameworks, which is sort of building the themes for a study. Okay, so I'm just going to so let's take a break for 10 minutes. So it's 10:22. I'll start again at 10:32. Okay, is that all right? Yeah. Okay. Right, so I'm back. Let's continue. So can you see a slide on the screen that says conceptual framework?
Yes, Doc, I can see it.
Yeah.
Yes,
Good, thank you.
Doc.
Okay, thank you. Okay, just to check. Okay, so let me go here. All right, so as a student, so a question I have is, what is so the reason why I put this in is because there's often a bit of confusion about what a conceptual framework is and what a theoretical framework is, and are they the same thing? Are they different things? So the question I would ask you is, what do you understand by a conceptual framework? And did you use, when you did your last project, not all your projects, but when you did your last project, did you use a conceptual framework or a theoretical framework? So let me just ask you that question. So what what do you understand by a conceptual framework? Or also ask the question, a theoretical framework. Do you see a difference between the two? Let's ask that question. Do you think there's a distinction between a conceptual framework and a theoretical framework?
Can I go
Yes.
first and explain?
Yeah.
I think there is the difference between theoretical framework and conceptual framework. I would say that the theoretical framework is based on established theories from the literature, not from your literature, and it is more formal. And if you look at conceptual framework, it's not more formal, but practical. It's flexible and practically. And when using a conceptual framework, you basically, or it's based on the concept that you define in your study. It's basically about defining the concept for the study that you are conducting, whereas in the theoretical framework, as I indicated, that it's basically based on established theories from literature. Then, uh, yeah, so that's all that I can say about the difference between the theoretical framework and the conceptual framework and theoretical framework.
Okay, good, thanks. Anybody else? Anybody else want to comment on the distinction between conceptual frameworks and theoretical frameworks? Okay. Where's my slide? Okay, so I'm going to so I think the key thing here is that a student would normally be expected to produce a conceptual framework or a theoretical framework when they are developing their proposal. And as I said, I think there's often some confusion around what is what. And I think Mfuno's explanation is one that I would agree with. Mfundo's explanation, sorry, is one that I would agree with. So the way I see it is the conceptual framework is something more broad than a theoretical framework, which is made up of specific theories. But we also want to look at what other people say. So I have found this diagram. I can't remember the source of it, and I think this is quite a nice diagram. And I'll share I've got a better. It's not much better, but I've got a better image than this that I've got on the screen. But I think this kind of gives quite a nice distinction between the conceptual framework and the theoretical framework. But it also introduces what we discussed in the last session about quantitative and qualitative philosophy in terms of it kind of it shows a distinction between how a more quantitative approach and how a qualitative approach would manage the frameworks. So a conceptual framework in this particular image is defined as a researcher-constructed, logically developed argument justifying the need for the research study. So it's almost like the sort of an explanation of why the research is needed. So problem statement in a way. So your problem statement might be part of the conceptual framework. It shapes the study design and guides its development, and it answers questions of why is this research important and how does it contribute to new knowledge. So that's a way of kind of thinking about the conceptual framework. So it's and then you've got the theoretical framework, which is defined as the researcher-constructed structure explaining the concepts and premises from the theory or theories that ground the study, that scaffold the study. It answers the question, how does this theory shape the study? So it's much more theoretical. It would be based on more kind of existing theoretical knowledge that we have on the topic. And then the theory itself at the lower level is an abstract description of the relationships between ideas, statements, and concepts that helps us understand the world. And we'll look at a theoretical proposition in a minute. So on the left-hand side, you have the objectivist deductive approach, where you refine theory through hypothesis testing. That's a quantitative design. On the right-hand side, the arrow going up on the right-hand side is a subjectivist inductive, where you develop or refine theory from data. So it's just looking at the different approaches to the more quantitative versus the more qualitative. For a quantitative study, your conceptual framework is finalized before data collection. Your theory is selected and operationalized to create a framework that supports the research questions and directs the analytical approach. So you're testing a theory with the quantitative design. It involves hypothesis generation, prediction, and testing, and it leads to theory refinement or falsification. So with a quantitative approach, usually, not always, but usually what we do is we start with a theory that we want to test. We generate a hypothesis around that theory. We test that using data, and then we either reject or accept the theory, and then based on that, we can refine the theory. And I'll show you ways in which we can develop theory from existing theory. The qualitative approach works the other way around. The conceptual framework evolves as new insights develop. And remember earlier we spoke about the timing of when things are narrowed down. So the quantitative, you're going to narrow down very quickly to what you want to measure. The qualitative is much more sort of exploratory, and it's much more subjective in how it occurs. A tentative framework is for the theoretical framework. A tentative framework is proposed, then refined as data are collected, and as the researcher's understanding evolves. So you can do a qualitative study starting with a theoretical proposition, but it's usually the point of doing a qualitative study is usually to develop the theory rather than to start with the theory. And then the theory involves different ways of seeing the world and shapes aspects of the research extent that the shaping varies, so should be described. So it's a very different approach to the quantitative approach. So I think this is quite a nice diagram which kind of shows the difference between or sort of explains the difference between a conceptual framework, a theoretical framework, and how they're applied under the two broad types of research that we can use. So again, if you're guiding a student, this would be something useful that you might be able to show them to sort of so that they can understand the difference between the conceptual and the theoretical framework. Right. So Maxwell, I think I've shared a chapter with you by Maxwell. Maxwell has a qualitative book, Designing Qualitative Research. And in that book, he has a very nice chapter on developing conceptual framework, or it's about conceptual frameworks, and he's got exercises in that chapter on how you can do that process. So he defines the conceptual framework as the system of concepts, assumptions, expectations, beliefs, and theories that support and inform your research. That sounds a bit like a theoretical framework, and in fact, he also says in the chapter this can also be called the theoretical framework. So this is where the confusion comes in. So you get people using the terminology interchangeably. So there isn't a clear distinction between what a conceptual framework and a theoretical framework is. And that's why I like this diagram, because it sort of makes a distinction between the conceptual framework answering the question, why is the research important and how does it contribute to new knowledge? Whereas the theoretical framework is answering the question, how does this theory shape the study? That gives a much more sort of a clearer distinction between the two. Okay, so and then Maxwell also promotes the idea of a visual model, or it could be a written narrative that explains the main things to be studied, key factors, concepts, or variables, and the relationship between them. But that also sounds very much like a theoretical framework rather than a conceptual framework. But then importantly here, the research problem is part of the conceptual framework. So that that does sort of link to that previous definition of what the conceptual framework is, where you're saying what the problem is rather than sort of going into detail about the theories themselves. So Maxwell identifies 4 main sources of ideas a student can use in a conceptual framework. So it's experiential knowledge, so that's what you see around you, what you observe. It's not necessarily coming from a research paper. It's what you see in the world. Also existing theory and research, so that those would be coming from research papers, books, various sources that we commonly use in the academic environment. You can also use reports and things as well. Pilot and exploratory studies, so that's where you would do a pilot study to try and find out what was going on, and you can use the information from that to build your conceptual framework. And then also thought experiments, so that's thinking through a problem. I'm not going to go into detail about thought experiments, but it's where you it's a desktop exercise of working through a problem to try and develop a framework for a particular problem. And then Maxwell has got some very useful exercises that students could use. For example, reflecting on experiential knowledge and drawing a concept map. So, so he's got an exercise reflecting on your experiential context, where the student would, if they do that exercise, they would consider what's going on around them as part of building a framework. And then also creating a concept map, which is very similar to the bubble map referred to in the Huff example of joining a conversation. So it's a similar kind of activity. So those are some examples of activities that students could do to develop their conceptual framework. Okay, the theoretical framework, as discussed, is more theory-based. So it's where you're actually going to have a specific theory. It could be a group of theories, but it could be that's where you're actually coming up with specific theory for your study. And I was attending a writing workshop a few years back, and the professor that was presenting made a comment: every sentence in the literature review should have a reference, which is quite interesting. He's from the science discipline, and so I can understand why he would have made that comment. But it means if you follow that sort of logic, then it means that you wouldn't use experiential knowledge as part of your proposal, because if you have to have a reference, your experimental, unless you can somehow link that to your experiential knowledge, you're relying literally, everything that you're writing is coming from some kind of academic source or some published source. I suppose you could also have a reference, which is what somebody says may be a personal comment citation. But so that suggests that your literature review couldn't be a conceptual framework, but that's, for me, that doesn't really work. There should be some space for making a comment about what you've observed, for example, which won't be referenced. You can say, I saw this happening, or this has been observed to happen. So I think that's it's quite a strict idea for a literature review. Okay, I've also shared a paper by Grant and Ozanlu on theoretical frameworks, and they make a point that theoretical frameworks are often minimally covered, they're not included. They can confuse and frustrate students, and journals often won't publish a theoretical work. So there isn't sort of examples of theoretical frameworks out there readily available. They make the point that theoretical framework is the foundation from which all knowledge is constructed for a study. It provides structure and support for the rationale, the problem statement, the purpose, and so on. So they're all interlinked with each other. And then the choice of framework will reflect personal beliefs and understanding of the nature of knowledge. So that links back to this idea of your preference for doing quantitative or qualitative based on the way you see the world. And then they make the point that theoretical and conceptual frameworks are not interchangeable nor the same. And so for them, theoretical framework is derived from existing theory or theories that have been already tested or validated as is considered generally acceptable theory. And for quantitative research, the theoretical frameworks are developed a priori, which means that you have the theory at the start of the research. So before you start collecting data in the field, your theoretical framework is in place. And then they also use a similar definition to the conceptual framework as the diagram. Conceptual framework is the researcher's understanding of how the research problem will be explored, and the relationship between the different variables of the study. So that's kind of linking more to how the problem is going to be investigated rather than what the variables are that are going to be measured in the study. And then they give examples of theoretical frameworks, and they give a checklist for integrating a theoretical framework. So that's quite a nice paper to look at for better understanding of a theoretical framework. Okay, and then just also to make a point about levels of theory, there's different levels of theory. So we can sort of classify a theory as being meta, grand, mid-range, micro theory, or macro, meso, micro theory. And the next slide has got a table. So small-scale, time-bound university projects are not going to be testing grand or macro theory. So just to be aware that when we're talking about theory in an academic context for a research project at a university, for example, it's going to be a small scale. It's usually a small scale. I shouldn't say it's not. It's usually a small scale context, time-bound project, which is very unlikely to be taking on a meta theory or a grand theory. So those grand theories are developed over a long period of time and require a lot of work to develop them. So it's not something that's going to be done with a quick honors project or a quick master's project. So it's just important to bear that in mind. So this is a nice table which gives examples of different levels of theory. I'm not going to go into detail. You can look at the table in your own time. But just to say that, so for example, I'm just saying here, Marx and Weber, for example, grand theory would be Marx's theory, economics theory, Darwin's theory of evolution, for example. So those are are very grand, big theories, and as I mentioned, they would take a long time to develop them. You'd need a lot of research and knowledge to propose a grand theory.
Please.
Yeah, sorry.
Next slides. We're
Can you
still
see?
at the
Can
move
you
the slides, doctor.
can you see a table?
There's no table. There's
Okay.
this.
Okay.
There's this table. Can move back to the table, please?
Yeah. Okay. Can you see it now?
At level of theories.
Yes, Doc, I can see on my side.
There's no table here.
There is a table,
Okay,
levels of theory. It talks about level focus and how they are being used.
Yeah. Okay. Can you see it, Theodora?
I'm seeing levels of theory, meta theory, grand, and
Right,
is there where you are?
And then if we go back again now, can you see it?
There's the table. Thank you very much.
Okay, good. It's strange. It's very weird that some people can see it and some people can't. Okay. Yeah. So I suppose it's individual systems that are reacting differently. Okay. So usually in an academic level, we would normally be working at this micro level. And it might not be considered in the usual sense because they focus on understanding a phenomenon at a very specific level in a very specific context. But yeah, so I think it's just important to understand which level we're normally working at, and yeah. So you could, yeah. So just have a look at this, and then the important thing is I think to understand that our kind of level of working is it's sort of micro or maybe a mid-range level. Rather than the grand or meta theory level. You need to, as I say, you need to have been working in a field for a very long time and have collected a lot of information and a lot of observation and done a lot of theorizing to come up with a grand or a meta theory. Okay, so yeah, but it's so that's just the idea about the level of theory. Okay, so common problems that students make with their proposals. So as part of my work in StatCon, where we review students' proposals, and also as part of my role on the ethics committee, we review proposals. Common mistakes that students make, which you can look out for, are that they don't have a conceptual or theoretical framework. They don't include one at all. And you don't necessarily need one, but depending on the field that you're working in and the type of work that the student is doing. But it's still, I think it would usually be expected, and most faculties and most departments, I think, would expect the student to have some kind of conceptual or theoretical framework in their proposal. At honours or masters or PhD level. The other problem can be a use of inappropriate concepts or theories. So there might be a framework, but the concepts and things are wrong, or they're not appropriate for the topic. They might be combining concepts and theories inappropriately. And another problem that often is that there could be a listing of research, past and current research, but there's no synthesis into a conceptual framework. So there's a list of studies that have been done, but there's no integration of that information into some kind of framework. So it's just a list rather than a sort of analysis of the concepts and the framework, the sort of pre-existing frameworks. Okay, so defining concepts, I think I've given you a chapter by Blakey, which is, I really like using this chapter. It's called Sample Research Designs. And the reason why I like using the chapter is because it's got very strong linkage between the different components of the research. So if you think about those chains in that original diagram that I showed, it has those chains, and it kind of makes the linkages between the chains very clear. But one of the key things that I use this chapter for is the defining and operationalizing of constructs to demonstrate that. So when you developing a conceptual framework or a theoretical framework, you're going to have concepts that you need to work with, and we need to define those concepts. So this is the process of going through that. And again, weaknesses that we see in student proposals are that they don't provide a definition of the constructs that they want to measure. So there's no definition of the construct. If a concept is identified, the researcher doesn't conduct a thorough literature review and misses possible definitions or chooses a poor quality definition of the concept. And then there could be other problems with choosing and using definitions as well. So in certain disciplines, there can be more than one definition of a concept. And that can then you have to make a choice about which concept, which definition you want to use. And it doesn't have to be a problem that there are multiple definitions. It's just, and the key thing is just explaining which one you're using and why you're using it, just providing a good justification for why that particular definition is relevant for the context that you're using. Okay, so then, so this is an example of a construct from the chapter by Blakey that I've shared with you. So this is an environmental, the example that he uses in the chapter is an environmental related problem. And then he provides a definition of environmental worldview, which is attitudes towards issues such as the preservation of wilderness, environments, and natural flora. Sorry, let me start that again. Attitudes towards issues such as the preservation of wilderness environments and natural flora and fauna, the conservation of natural resources, environmental degradation, environmental impacts of economic growth, and the use of science and technology to solve environmental problems. So they've kind of, the idea here is that the worldview of a person in terms of the environment would be made up of their attitudes towards these different issues. So the preservation of wilderness environments, the role of science and technology to solve environmental problems, and so on. So that's how they're defining it, and we'll look at the measurement in a later session. So how do they actually measure that particular concept? It's so you've defined it here, but we don't yet know how it's going to be measured. So environmentally responsible behavior, another concept, is defined as the individual actions that preserve nature and conserve resources, and involvement in communal actions that confront environmental problems and seek solutions. So that's the definition that they're using for environmentally responsible behavior. And then they've got other constructs, age, which is the number of years since birth, and gender, which is socially defined categories of male and female based on human biological differences. So with the gender variable, I've put that in. That's you have to think that this book was published in 2000, but the kind of idea about gender has changed over time. So to kind of define gender as being categories of male and female in 2025 could be considered problematic. So because gender's moved on since categories of male and female. So, and also just to also think about, we've got different conceptualizations here. So you've got sex, you've got gender, you've got sexual preference. And each of those three constructs have different definitions, and they could have contested definitions. So there's currently a lot of debate in society about trans people, for example, and there's groups of people who are anti-trans, and there's groups of people that are pro-trans, and that leads to lots of debate. So it's not a simple, defining a concept is not always a simple thing, as you can see from the kinds of arguments and debates that go on in society about a particular group of people. So it's not necessarily as simple as saying gender is male and female. That definition doesn't necessarily work in this context, in our current context. And also politically, there are certain countries that don't recognize genders other than male and female, for example. So I had to we were working on an online survey which was being run in another country. And in South Africa, if we used the gender variable, we would say male, female, and have other options. but in that country, the researchers weren't prepared to use the other options because those other options are politically sensitive in that country. So that's something to be aware of in terms of doing research, is that you can't always, there's different people have different ideas about what the allowable definition is. And I'm not going to have a sort of political debate about that now, but those are the kinds of things that you have to confront as a researcher defining constructs. Okay, so once we've defined the construct, we now can start working with them. And in quantitative research, let's just go through some of the aspects of I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what quantitative research is because it's fairly self-evident, but two key points about quantitative research, and I'm just using this slide of strengths of quantitative research from a paper by Johnson and Ongubuzi, is testing and validating already constructed theories, which we've also seen from the theoretical framework and sort of component, and testing hypotheses that are constructed before the data is collected. So quantitative research would usually involve this kind of process. It doesn't always have to. We can do descriptive research where we don't test a theory, and those research projects can be very useful in so sometimes what the Stats South Africa does, for example, is they might do a baseline study where they go to an area and conduct a sort of poverty survey to establish what the level of living conditions is on an area. So they're not testing a theory by doing that research. They're simply collecting data about what the conditions are of the people in the households in that area. They're not testing a theory. They're just describing what's going on. And that's a perfectly feasible approach to take for research. Another example would be a study that they did of chiropractors in Switzerland. It's a study that I use as an example of a descriptive study where they simply ask questions like, how many patients do you have? How much time do you spend with the patients, and so on. It's not testing a theory, it's just describing what's going on. And that's an important component we need to describe what's going on before we can so that allows us to understand the context, and then we can start thinking about a theoretical component later on once we've got that description. But in general, if you're doing a sort of master's or a PhD, there would be an expectation that you contribute to the theoretical debate in an area. And this is where the testing and validating of constructed theories comes into play. I've shared with you a chapter by Wetton called Modeling Theoretical Propositions. This is from the Huff book on designing research for publication. And it's a very good chapter to help you think about theoretical propositions, what they are, and then also how to maybe extend the theoretical propositions, how to state one, and then also how to, if you need to contribute to existing theory, how you can expand your theory to develop new theory. So common weaknesses that we see in proposals would be that there's no theory at all, which is the research doesn't have to test the theory, but there might be, if they are planning to test the theory, there should at least be some statement of a theory. There could be a theory in the proposal, but it's not convincingly conceptualized. So there could be a no or poor justification for the proposed relationship. There could be an appropriate theory, but it's poorly defined and operationalized. So that's another issue. And then there could be an appropriate theory, but one or more of the constructs is not measured. So sometimes what happens is students, they combine the two variables into one set of questions. So let's say, for example, you have customer satisfaction as an outcome variable and quality of sort of service as the independent variable. What the students will do is they'll combine those two things into one question. So you can't measure them separately, and then you can't test the theory because they're measured in one as one variable instead of two separate variables. So that's these are sort of sometimes the problems that occur in the design of the study. Okay, this is an example of a theoretical proposition. So it's a very simple model. So you've got a construct X and a construct Y, and you want to test the relationship between those two constructs. There will be assumptions around those constructs, and then there will be those constructs will be measured in a particular context. So you need to kind of indicate who the constructs are being measured from, when it's occurring and where it's occurring, because all those things are important. So if we do a study in America, it might have a different kind of implication to doing a study in South Africa, for example. When it occurs is also important. Something that happened 20 years ago could be very different to what happens today because because of the time difference, for example. So have any of you had an example of a theoretical proposition that you've tested with your research? Has anybody got an example of a theory that they've tested? Has anybody tested a theory with their research?
Not me.
No, okay, that's fine. Okay.
On my side, no, Doc, no.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so can you give me an example then? Thanks for the Kenny. Thanks for the link to that reference. I do have that paper, and if I haven't got it online for you, I will share it with you online. Okay, so yeah, I've got that paper, which I've got a copy of it, so I can share it with you. Okay, so can anybody give me so looking at this diagram, do I have it on the screen still? Yeah. Can you give me an example just of an example where you have a construct X and a construct Y? The construct X is your independent variable and your construct Y is your dependent variable. Can you give me an example of a relationship that you might want to test, where you want to see what the relationship is between the independent and the dependent variable? Nobody. Okay, you're a difficult audience today. Okay. Right. So just for an example, I've just been recently working on a project where the student is doing a study where they're looking at customer satisfaction and also customer loyalty. So they're looking at the linkage between those, and they're specifically interested in online purchasing. So, and the study is based in Soweto. So in terms of the context, the study would be current, so it's occurring now. The people who are involved in the study, or the sample, would be people who make online purchases, and they would be living in Soweto. So that's the kind of contextual assumption. And then what he's looking at is the relationship between the quality of service provided by the companies that are providing online sales and the customer satisfaction, and then also their loyalty to that particular, or to the businesses that they might use for purchasing online. So it could be Takealot, for example, or I guess Amazon, or anybody that's doing, or Checkers 660, for example. These are all companies that are providing online purchase options. So he's got a number of construct X's. His construct X's are things like the quality of information that the business provides, the security of their payment system, the speed of delivery, those kinds of variables would be the construct X's. There would be multiple construct X's. And then his construct Y is he's got two dependent variables. One is the customer satisfaction, and then the customer loyalty is another variable. And it was an interesting, he's measuring that using intention to repurchase, and the other thing would be the willingness of the customer to sell or to promote the business to other people. So those were that was his idea about measuring customer loyalty. And I don't know a lot about customer loyalty. And when I met with him, I said, I'm not sure whether those variables or those sort of concepts that you're measuring are measures of customer loyalty, whether you intend to repurchase from the same company. But when I Googled customer loyalty and looked at how they define customer loyalty, they mention things like intention to use the company again as being a representation of loyalty. And they also mentioned the customer's willingness to promote the goods or the business to other people was also an indication of loyalty. So I was confident from reading that he had a decent definition of the customer loyalty variable. Okay, so what we're doing in a quantitative project is we then want to measure those things, and then we want to look at the relationship between them. So theoretically, you would think that your hypothesis would be that you sort of hypothesize that the higher the quality of service provided, the greater the customer satisfaction would be, and that's the kind of relationship that they would look at there. And then the greater the satisfaction, the greater the loyalty would be towards the companies. And I think that's so the conceptual assumption there would be that those relationships might already exist, and then you want to test them for the context that you're then studying in. Okay, so the other nice thing about the chapter from Wetton is that, and I'm not sure if I've got the spelling right here, it's either, I'm not sure if it's an O or an N, I must really correct that. I think Wetton, I think it's an E, but I've got it with an O here. I must just make a note of checking that. So when you're doing research, and this applies to your students, particularly if you're doing a master's or a PhD, and you're doing a quantitative project, there would be an expectation that you make a new contribution to the theoretical area that you're working in. And the nice thing about the Wetton chapter is that he makes suggestions for how to develop new theoretical propositions. So it's how you could add to the existing theory, not just test so you wouldn't just be testing the existing theory, you would be adding to the existing theory. So the one way you can do that is, the first option is an X focused proposition. So the X is the independent variable. So you know that sorry, is there okay, I'm just muting Theodora. Okay, so the first way you can contribute to a conversation is that here you know Y is important. So Y is the dependent variable. So let's say we're talking about customer satisfaction as the dependent variable. We know that customer satisfaction is important in the sort of area that you're working in. And now you then, as the researcher, propose a new independent variable which might influence customer satisfaction. So let's say, for example, nobody's ever looked at delivery speed, for example, and the relationship between delivery speed and customer satisfaction. You can then measure delivery speed and look at that relationship. So you're adding something new to the theory about what factors impact customer satisfaction. You can also do it the other way around, where it's a Y-focused proposition. So Y is the dependent variable. So we know that X is important, and then you introduce a new dependent variable for your research. So we say, okay, well, we know that security concerns about online purchases are important. And instead of focusing on customer satisfaction, you then focus on, say, customer loyalty, because nobody's looked at that before. Nobody's looked at the relationship between concerns about security of purchases online and the relationship between customer loyalty. So you can then look at that relationship. So you're adding something new to the debate. There's also more complicated. Just check if the slide has changed. We've moved to a more complex table with moderators and mediators. Can you see that slide? Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of these models, but here you can sort of add a moderator. I'll explain what a moderator is in a second. You can also add mediators. So you know that there's a relationship between, let's say, X and Y, which could be the concerns about security and customer loyalty. And you're going to say you want to see if customer satisfaction moderates that relationship between security and customer loyalty. You can also add a mediator, which is a intervening variable. So you know that there's a relationship between security and customer loyalty, and you want to see if customer satisfaction mediates that relationship between those variables. You can also add multiple independent variables or have multiple dependent variables, and you can also make more complex relationships. So in the last example, you might know that there's a relationship between various quality variables and satisfaction, but nobody's looked at then the relationship between satisfaction and loyalty, for example, which is what this research is doing. So these are examples of how you can add to existing theoretical propositions, which you need to try and do if you're doing a quantitative study or if your students are doing a quantitative study at a master's or a PhD level. You can also do this at honors level as well if you have the capacity. But the problem with honors projects is because there's such a limited time to do them, and it might make it more difficult to collect data and test a model in a very short space of time. Okay. Then there's to talk about moderation. A moderating variable is a variable that alters the direction or the strength of a relationship between a predictor and outcome variable, and it interacts with the independent variable to influence the level of the dependent variable. An example of this would be the gender of a worker, which is the moderating variable, and the occupation of a worker, which is the independent variable, and the income that the worker gets. So, for example, the occupation that a man and a woman works in might lead to a male getting more income than the female, for example. So there's an interaction between the gender and the occupation, which then influences the amount of salary that the men and the women get. And it's kind of well understood that there's certain occupations where, well, I think that there's certain occupations where men will earn more than women, for example. So there's an interaction. You can't just look at the relationship between the occupation and the salary without taking gender into account. And then if you ignore the moderator, then the intervention might be inappropriate. So we need to be aware that there are these moderating effects. So if we know, for example, that women are earning less than men in certain occupations, then that allows us to then say we need some kind of intervention to make that problem right, or to correct that problem. A mediating variable explains the relationship between a predictor and an outcome variable. So it works as a mechanism through which a predictor influences the outcome variable. An example is that there could be a relationship between maths ability and a person's interest in doing a maths major. So the stronger a learner is in maths, or a student is in maths, the more likely they are to want to do a maths major. But then we also have self-efficacy as a mediator in that relationship. So if self-efficacy is a significant mediator, it creates the reason for why the student with a higher maths ability will be more interested in doing a maths major. So that variable is critical in influencing that relationship between the maths ability and the person's interest in doing a maths major. And it's important to measuring mediating effects is important to identify mechanisms in relationships which or variables which influence the mechanism between two variables. Okay, so this is just the example of the mediator in graphic form. So you have your maths ability, you have pupils with different maths ability. You have maths self-efficacy, which is your sort of almost confidence in sort of being able to do maths, and then you have it's a more psychological variable, and then you've got your interest in doing a maths major. So that maths self-efficacy sort of drives the relationship between the ability and the interest in a math major. So and those are going back to these examples of propositions. You can consider mediating and moderating variables to develop on existing theory. Okay, and then one of the also another key recommendation from Wetton is to create a diagram of your theory. So when your student is doing a quantitative project and they might be testing a theory, it's good to have a model, a sort of visual model of what that theory looks like. Okay, and I've got a nice example of a model that I've recently analyzed for a student where it's much more complicated than this. It would sort of maybe it's not a good idea to show you that one, but it gives you an indication of the kinds of things that you can measure. And this is a very simple model, but you can have much more complicated models than this to test as well. Okay, and then I'm going to move. Okay, so that's the conceptual part of a study. So you basically you have a topic. To kind of focus the topic, you need to decide what constructs you're going to be working with. In a quantitative context, you normally want to test a theory with your study, and that would lead you to decide what variables, independent and dependent variables, that you're going to be measuring. And then you're going to then measure those and test the relationship between them. And that's you have a theoretical framework that you might be wanting to test for your study. And then you develop specific theoretical propositions within that framework, which you can then test using data. So that's the kind of conceptual side of it. But then we need to move to the methodological side. So how are we going to actually do this in terms of methodology? So this is the design in terms of the concepts, but then we need to say what kind of methodology are we going to be using for measuring these concepts and analyzing them. So that's where we move to research methodology. And I'm looking at the time. We should be able, I might get through this actually. Okay, so having identified a problem, you need to make research design choices in order to examine the problem. Common mistakes that students make is that they omit key components. It can be as bad as the student saying that they're going to do a qualitative study when they're doing a quantitative study, or they could say that they're doing a qualitative study when they're actually doing a quantitative study. So that we do see proposals where the incorrect methodology is being used, or so it's usually just a mistake that the students made, that they should have said quantitative instead of qualitative, but it's quite a serious mistake to make at that level. It could also be that there's no motivation for the choice. So the student will say, I'm using a quantitative design, but they don't really explain why that's relevant for there's no motivation for why they're choosing that quantitative design, why it's the best option for their particular problem. So and then they might choose the wrong survey strategy. That's quite a common mistake. And sometimes, or sometimes they don't mention the strategy at all, which is also not a good thing. But they also, sometimes what can happen is that the student actually should be doing, say, a case study, and then they end up doing a survey, for example. So they choose the wrong option. And sometimes that's driven by the context that they're working in. So it's a, you know, they might have been told that they have to do a quantitative project, even though, even though a qualitative project might be more appropriate. And it's because their supervisor might want them to learn about quantitative methods, for example. But it's actually, if you look at the problem that they're investigating, a much better approach would be to use a qualitative case study based approach or something like that. So that can happen as well. Yeah, so it's just important to try and fit the correct methodology to the type of problem that's being investigated. Okay, so I'm coming back to the research onion here. Just to say that a student can choose from these different methodologies to examine a problem. And we're now going to move to the quantitative, we're going to move to the second layer, which is the methodological choice. So we're moving away from the philosophy, down from the philosophy to the methodological choice, and we're going to be focusing on the quantitative components. So if they're doing if their problem is such that quantitative design is appropriate, they can choose quantitative methods, or they can choose mixed methods if they, which either of those would have a quantitative dimension to it. Okay, so just to kind of look at scientific research, and I think any research that we do. Scientific research sounds like it applies to science, but it also applies to social sciences as well. And as part of that, the principles of scientific research is that this applies to social sciences and science disciplines, any discipline really, is that we need to be posing significant questions that can be investigated. So there must be, the project must be feasible and doable. We need to link the research to relevant theory. So we've talked about the theoretical aspects. Then we must use methods, important for this section that I'm now discussing, is use methods that permit direct investigation of the question. And that's what we're going to be looking at now. So what kinds of approaches can we use to investigate the problem? Provide a coherent and explicit chain of reasoning. Replicate and generalize across studies. That might not always be possible, but that's something that we try and aim for. And then we disclose research to encourage professional scrutiny and critique. So when we do research, we send dissertations to examiners, we send research papers to reviewers. So we want to get feedback from professionals on our work. Okay, so I must also note that some of these slides are from Prof. Vanessa Sherman, who was she was a facilitator of the course. So this would be one of her slides. Okay, I'm using her slides here. Okay, so quantitative research, I think I've already mentioned this. So we're moving down a layer to the methodological choice, to quantitative designs. We're not, so we're focusing on quantitative designs for this course. So in natural sciences and social sciences, quantitative research is the systematic empirical investigation of observable phenomenon via statistical, mathematical, or computational techniques. This would be this relates to the scientific approach in the previous slide. And it's systematic empirical investigation. So meaning that we have to have a systematic process that we follow, and empirical means we're collecting some kind of information to analyze. The word empirical means so empirical also applies in a qualitative way, because you collect data when you are doing qualitative work as well. It's just the key thing about the quantitative research is the statistical, mathematical, and computational techniques, which wouldn't be present in the qualitative dimension. Okay, we know that quantitative research is deductive. And then just an important quote from Popper, who's a very renowned research philosophy author. Theories cannot be verified absolutely and forever. However, they can be falsified. So they can be proven to be wrong to a certain degree of certainty or probability. So what that's saying is that we can't ever prove anything absolutely. We never know that something is true for 100% of the time. But we can falsify information or data that we collect to a certain level, and that's where the statistical analysis comes in. And we'll talk more about the degree of certainty or probability when we get to the analysis component of the course. But this is kind of leading to that, to say when we look at a particular problem, when we observe something, we can think that it's true, but we don't know that there might always be another instance which disproves it being true. So that's why we say we can't verify something forever, absolutely or forever, and because things change over time. But we can falsify based on a test at a certain degree of certainty, and that's where so we can that's why we set a hypothesis, and that's why we test the hypothesis, and then we can conclude about the hypothesis based on the statistic, which is the level of probability that we use. There's also newer methodologies now which don't rely so much on probability, or they also they add in you add in sort of other information which makes the probability more valid. Okay. I'm not going to talk about this. This is also deductive reasoning, top-down approach. It's just looking at the distinction between quantitative and qualitative approaches. But just the quote at the end is important, though. In reality, the line between deductive and inductive approaches is blurred, and most research projects will combine the strengths of both. So that's just saying, although we have these approaches, it's not set in stone that they're going to work. There isn't a sort of a one sample fits all kind of idea behind these different approaches. There's a lot of overlap, but there can be overlap between them. Okay, I'm not going to go through this slide. It's just going through the strengths and weaknesses of quantitative research. So just to know that there are certain strengths and weaknesses of quantitative research, and that so it could be it's worth so in some ways these can be used to motivate for why a research project is using a quantitative approach. And theoretically, quantitative research should be quick. It should provide precise quantitative numerical data. The data analysis should be quite quick to do. And then, so these are some of the advantages or strengths of quantitative research. It's not always, there's always exceptions to these advantages, though. Sometimes things don't quite work out the way you expect them to. So the weakness of quantitative research is that because the researcher is so involved in developing or defining the constructs and developing the measure, how those constructs are being measured, you might not get the you might not be representing what's actually going on. Because your idea of what's going on and what you think should be important is not necessarily what's actually important. And that's where so you might miss out on phenomenon that would be important because it hasn't been noticed, for example. So there are some, and because you're working with large samples and the information is usually quantitative research can be quite superficial. You're not getting information about maybe smaller numbers of cases where things are not so good, because you're looking at the majority of responses rather than the minority of responses. So you might be missing out on important information, but yeah, so it's always a danger of quantifying things, is that because we then focus on the bigger percentages, you then lose the relevance of the smaller percentages. And I'm guilty of doing that when I do analysis. So when I analyze information, I usually dismiss the smaller the categories that occur in a smaller number, because we're more interested in the majority rather than the minority. And that's why we need qualitative research, because the qualitative research will tell us the stories of those minorities. Okay, some fields are more or less quantitative in nature. So if you think about the projects or the faculties which, so StatCon supports research at UJ, and the faculties we support the most are College of Business and Economics, the Health Sciences faculty, and then Engineering and Built Environment. We get smaller numbers of projects from humanities, education, and science, and we get virtually no projects from FADA, which is architecture, design, and arts, and law. They don't tend to do quantitative-based projects. They should, but they don't. So that's a sort of bit of a picture of just showing that different disciplines are more focused on quantitative research. Okay, and then an important component of research, of the research design, is the research strategy. So this is the next layer down. So you've decided to do a quantitative project or a mixed methods project, and then you need to choose a strategy, which is the third layer down of the onion. So there's experiments there, surveys there, archival research, case studies. And I think so often we see that students don't put in they don't sort of indicate a strategy. So they don't say that they're doing an experiment or a case study or whatever. And that's it's quite an important thing to leave out, because the strategy is a critical part of the design, and it sort of indicates what kind of data you're going to be doing. I just want to see what's going on here. I heard a bleep. Okay, I'm not going to can't see anything here. Okay, I'm going to now focus on those research strategies. So we've got surveys. So this is from a textbook by Mouton. It's quite an old text, but I've tried to add some new things on here. But you get quantitative designs, which are things like surveys, comparative cross-cultural and cross-national studies, experimental designs in the laboratory, natural experiments in the field, statistical modeling and computer simulation studies, secondary data analysis, and so on. So those are some quantitative designs that the student can use. Then you get your qualitative designs, and then you get evaluation research, which is he's put this into a different category. And then you get your desktop or non-empirical studies, where you're doing conceptual analysis, theory building or model building studies, and so on. So they don't involve any sort of primary data collection. So it's empirical, meaning you're collecting some primary data. Non-empirical studies would be that you are doing a sort of more desktop-based study. You're not going into the field to actually collect data. Okay, so the main kind of study that.
Sorry, Doc.
Yes,
Sorry, Doc, can I ask you a question?
Yes, yeah.
With regard to the previous one where you were showing the qualitative and quantitative designs. So can one use a visual ethnography in quantitative, because in quali we have been using it, especially if you want to see what participants are saying about your study that you're conducting on digital media platforms. So can one use a visual ethnography on quantitative?
So ethnography as a design, tends to be more qualitative in nature. But there's no, so for me, ethnography is a specific kind of case study. So when I think about those, it's just my idea of it's partly and it's partly based on there's a book by Denscombe called Good Research Design, and he has chapters on surveys, experiments, case studies, um, uh, action research, and ethnography. So he kind of focuses on those five designs, and I think, so for me, an ethnographic study and a action research project are kind of very specific versions of a case study, and that action research is a project where you would be trying to solve a practical problem using action research. That's what's called action research. And then an ethnography is the examination of a community or a sort of culture, where the researcher is normally embedded in the culture or the community. So my understanding of an ethnographic study is where the researcher would go to a particular place and become part of that community, and then they do a very in-depth kind of investigation into the problem in that particular context. But they're there and they're part of that community. So it's a very it's a much more qualitative approach in the sense that the researcher is much more engaged with the community, interacting with the community, that kind of thing, which is not more quantitatively more kind of separate from it. There's no reason why you couldn't have a quantitative component within those designs, though. So if I think about a case study, case studies can have quantitative and qualitative components, and many mixed methods designs are case studies. So you can do you can administer a questionnaire with participants, and you can do observation, and you could do interviews, for example, with a case study. And I think you can do the same with an ethnographic study. You're talking about video. That's not a field that I'm that familiar with, but there's no reason why you couldn't, if you're doing a video study, there's no reason why you can't quantify components of what you are watching. So there's two types of observation. There's participant observation and there's structured observation. So if you're using participant observation, it's much more informal. You kind of make notes and you observe and so on, but you don't necessarily have a structure to what you're observing. With structured observation, you have a set of criteria that you're looking for. You have you have indicators that you're looking for, and then if you see what you're looking for, then you mark it off, you check it off, and you indicate how many times it's occurring and so on. So there's no reason why you couldn't do a structured observation if you're using an ethnographic video kind of study. Yeah, so you could incorporate it, but it depends on what you're videoing and so on. Yeah, or what's been videoed. Yeah. Does that kind of make sense? To have answered your question?
Yes, Doc. Yes, Doc. Thank you so much.
Okay. So, right. So then, but just also to say, I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with qualitative research. I've done some, but it's not most of my research has been, or that I'm involved in, is quantitative. I know about action research, and I know about ethnographic studies through development studies and so on, but it's not. I haven't practiced it myself, so it's not something that I'm completely. I'm aware of studies where people have used the methodology, but I haven't actually practiced it myself. So yeah. Okay, so it's just also to say that I think some of these things that he's listed under qualitative designs here, just to make a comment about that, I think some of these are more about analysis than about the strategy. So I think I wouldn't necessarily agree with everything that's here, but I understand why he's listed the different approaches there. Okay, so with the quantitative research, there's I'm going to focus on two main strategies. One is the survey strategy, I'm not going to go into detail about these slides. You can look at them later, but it's just highlighting the survey strategy. And the survey strategy, the point of the survey is to get information from a large group of people, or you might be surveying documents. So you're going to survey a large number of documents, for example. The idea is to get it's a large scale kind of project. It doesn't have to be massive, but you're going for numbers here, not for, it won't be a small size study. You can have different types of surveys, exploratory, descriptive, causal, and I've also got a slide coming up later about that. This is the idea, the meta theory behind is positivist, for example. So that links back to the theoretical sort of philosophy underpinning the design. Selection of cases could be probabilistic, but you might also have to use non-probabilistic sampling. We'll talk about sampling in a later session. The most common methods of data collection under the survey approach is the structured questionnaire. Just also to say that students often they often talk about surveys and questionnaires as being the same thing. But the questionnaire is a tool for data collection, which we can use as part of an experimental design. We can use it as part of a case study design. You could use questionnaires in action research. So the questionnaire is the data collection tool. It's not the strategy. The survey is the strategy, not the questionnaire. The questionnaire is the tool that we use to collect information. We use descriptive and inferential statistics for analysis, and then there's some common sources of error, sampling error, and so on, refusal rates. And then the limitations of the survey approach is there could be lack of depth of insider perspective. And then sometimes survey data can become very specific, context specific, so it might not be useful outside the context. So those are some of the characteristics of the survey, and it's a commonly used strategy. We do a lot of surveys. We support a lot of surveys in StatCon, for example. There's been a big boom in online questionnaires due to COVID. So before COVID, people used to collect data using the survey strategy and questionnaires in the field, but because things closed down during COVID, we've seen a big increase in online surveys now, which is not necessarily a good thing, but yeah, that's what's happened. The second design for quantitative research is the experimental strategy. Here, this is under this particular strategy, you normally applying a kind of control experimental intervention on subjects, people, usually people. You can also do things in labs with bacteria, for example, or plants. So this is a design that's used in the sciences, in psychology, and also in education. So we perform experiments on our students, for example. so there's usually people use interventions for learning interventions, for example, and then we use the experimental design to measure the cause and effect of the intervention. So the kind of question we would be addressing is a causal question, a pre and post. So does an intervention have an impact on some particular outcome, on, say, the performance of a student? The meta theory is behaviorism, as in behavioral sciences. Sampling, often with small numbers. Sometimes depending on the context, but we sometimes have small numbers of groups. You don't want them to be too small, though. The most common methods of data gathering are structured observation and physical measurements, or psychometric techniques. So the psychometric techniques usually involve using a questionnaire which measures some kind of psychometric attribute. Excuse me. And then methods and techniques to analyze data are mathematical and statistical. So we might use regression or analysis of variance. With the pre-post analysis, we would use repeated measures, ANOVA, for example. Common sources of error are experimental error, subject error, measurement error, and context effects. And we'll talk about some of those in more detail in the reliability and validity component. And then small sample sizes can make generalizability risky. So that's an important, so the experimental design and the survey strategy are two of the key quantitative approaches we use for doing quantitative research. But you can also do quantitative research doing case study approach as well. But the difference there is, yeah, I'll talk about the case study now. So we have, and I think the key thing for students to realize is that you wouldn't just say that you're doing a survey, or you wouldn't just say that you're doing an experiment. You wouldn't just say you're doing a case study or a mixed methods design. Within those broad categories of research strategy, there are specific types of strategies. So you can do a descriptive survey, or you can do an explanatory survey, for example. So if I go back to the survey slide, you can do descriptive, you can do causal surveys. So there's different types of design within the survey. Experiment, there's lots of different experimental designs. I've got some slides covering some of them. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. But the point is just to show you that there's lots of different types of experimental design that we can use for research, and the key is to find the best option and to avoid certain designs. For case studies as well, there's different designs. There's an author called Yin who writes about case studies. And I think I've got a chapter which I've shared with you where he talks about single case, multiple case, single case embedded design. So there's different types of case study designs that we can use. And then mixed methods, I've got a picture later for you to show you how mixed methods designs can work. So you don't just say that you're doing a mixed methods design, you specify what kind of mixed methods design that you're using for your research. It's much more, so this is going into more detail about the kind of design that you are using for the study. Okay, I'm going to skip through this because we're running out of time and I want to try and finish this today. So let's just go through. So this is just telling you that survey designs, you can have different types of survey designs. These are some of the experimental designs. So a simple two-group design would be a post-test only. So you only do the test after the intervention. So you have an experimental group which gets a treatment or an intervention, and then you get a comparison group which doesn't get the intervention. That's usually referred to as the control group. You put people into the groups by random assignment, and then you do a post-test after the treatment. And that would tell you whether the treatment, if you see a difference in the dependent variable, let's say it's academic performance, if you see that the experimental group has a better academic performance, then that would suggest that the treatment has worked. You can also get a post-test only two-group design. Yeah, so it's used to compare two treatments. So that's just describing the post-test only two-group design as I've just explained it. You can also get a before and after two-group design. There you have a pre-test and a post. You measure the dependent variable before and after the test, and then the experimental group gets the treatment or the intervention. The comparison group, which is the control group, doesn't get any treatment. And then you administer the pre-test and the post-test, and then theoretically the two groups should be the same in the beginning because they haven't had any intervention, and then they should differ at the end if the treatment has worked. So that's how that kind of design works. Okay, so as I said, people, researchers in education and psychology and in the sciences would use these kinds of experimental designs. So there's a lot of them. I'm not going into detail about all of these slides. You can just look through them and see what kinds of options would be available for you for designing a study. And then there's, yeah, these are all different types of experimental designs. There's also, you can read through this as well, this sort of tries to help you decide what kind of design that you would need to use based on the kind of context that you're studying and in the kind of groups that you have and the interventions that you're doing. So there's a whole list of options here for you, suggestions for using different kinds of designs. And then the key thing, and then there's also quasi-experimental design, which is using experiments where you don't use random assignment. The things to avoid are one group post-test only. So if if you only have one group, let's say you're doing an intervention with a group of students, and you do an intervention, and then you measure their performance at the end only, you don't know whether their performance is due to the intervention or some other factor, because there's no control group and there's no pre-measurement. So you don't know whether they would have been the same level before, and you've got no group to compare them to. So that's a terrible design to use. Never use a one group post-test only design. The post-test only non-equivalent groups design is also a difficult design to use, because what that means is that you've got two groups, but they're not equivalent to each other. So it might be, you might have a group of students and a group of civilians, and then you do an intervention, and then you do the post-test, but you don't know whether the post-test is different because it's different groups of people, or whether the intervention has had any kind of effect on because of the intervention, basically. And then the pre-test, post-test single group is also a weak design. That's where you have a single group of students, and you test them before and you test them after for performance. So you could say that if you can show there's a difference in the test result, let's say it's their performance. If you can show there's an improvement in performance, it could suggest that the intervention has led to the improvement, but it might also be that over time they would have improved anyway. So you don't know that it's the intervention because you've got no control group there. The problem with control groups is ethically, if the intervention works, then the control group hasn't had the opportunity to experience the intervention, which might have improved their performance. So there are ethics questions around experimental designs. But what you can do in those kinds of situations is say, if the intervention is thought to work or shown to work, then you can allow the control group to access the intervention once the experiment is over. The same thing would work in a health context. So let's say, for example, you are administering treatment to people with back pain, and you administer a treatment to one group and not to the other group, and your treatment is shown to improve the quality of the patient's back pain quality. The other group hasn't had the treatment, but then you can administer the treatment to them after the experiment is over so that they can then benefit as well. So that's the way of dealing with the ethical sort of issues around experimental designs. So always try and have a comparative group, which is a similar group to the one that you're testing. That's the key thing with experimental designs. Okay, these are more experimental designs, so I'm not going to go into these. Okay, then mixed methods is another quantitative approach. I just want to talk about that. So mixed methods, there are some academics, for example, Andrew Sayer and David Plowright, who reconceptualize research to avoid a quantitative-qualitative divide, and that's where the mixed methods kind of approach comes from. This is a very nice example from Leach and Ongobuzi from it's a paper that they've written, which I think which is also shared with you, where it shows. So what they've done here is they've got different kinds of the way the diagram works is that they kind of classify designs based on the mixing dimension, the time dimension, and the emphasis dimension. So the mixing dimension is it partially mixed or fully mixed? So is it so what that means is that when you mix the information, is it going to be, or is the quantitative component answering one question, and is the qualitative component answering another question? That would be partially mixed. Fully mixed would mean that the quantitative and the qualitative information are answering the same questions. That would be fully mixed. So the information that you get addresses the same question. That's the first dimension. The second dimension is the time. So are they happening, is the quantitative and the qualitative happening at the same time, or sequentially, is one after the other? Concurrent would be the same time, and then sequential will be one after the other. So that's if you use it. So if you're doing your quantitative component first, that would be, and then your qualitative component second, that would be a sequential design. And then the third question is emphasis dimension. So which one are they equally important? Is the quant and the qual equally important, or is the quant more important than the qual, or the qual more important than the quantitative? So that's your status dimension. So if you're doing a study where it's partially mixed, so you're answering one research question using a quantitative component and another research question using the qualitative component, that would be partially mixed. You then might be doing qualitative first and quantitative second. That's sequential. So that would take you to the sequential box. And then your quantitative might be the dominant component, and then your qualitative might be less important. So that would take you to the dominant status, not the equal status. So that would give you a partially mixed sequential dominant status design. And then they give you an example of a study which uses that kind of design in the paper. So the point about this is to say, if you're using mixed methods, don't just say that you're using mixed methods. Indicate more clearly or more specifically what kind of design that you're using based on some kind of structure like this. There's another writer called, it might even be Creswell, who's written about, who's also got a slightly different way of classifying the mixed methods design. But the key thing is, the key point about this is when the student is describing their methodology, they should be able to give a specific kind of detail like this. And that's a good thing to do. I don't think I've got much. I'm just going to push on a bit. I don't think I've got much more to say. So I'm just going to keep going. Yeah, I'm finishing now, actually. So this is a nice slide that Prof. Vanessa Sherman had, which I'm stealing from her. So just to make the point that when your plan in the beginning is that you're going to have a nice, easy ride to the end. But the reality is the road is going to be paved with, it's not everybody's reality, but some students' reality might be that the road is very bumpy and there might be some challenges along the way. And I think this diagram reflects that quite nicely. So yeah, so that's the sort of the final slide, and then any questions? Yeah, so I rushed a bit through the last few slides. Right, so are there any questions? Let me come back to the thing. Any questions?
There's no question from my side, Doc. I think Dr. Theodora mentioned something about the assignment 1, which is due on the 21st of September. May you kindly, if you have time, to go through it, because I might have missed that explanation of assignment 1. I was exhausted on Thursday, yes.
Okay, I did give a brief explanation of it in the beginning. I'm just going to try and find the handout. Sorry, just load it here quickly. Okay, I'm just going to write it here. Okay, I'm just going to use the original slide here. Why is this showing up here? I'm just going to close that. Okay, there's something going on with my Word now. Okay, so let me just need to come back here. Okay, so in principle, the assignment should be fairly straightforward, but it never is. Okay, so the idea behind this assignment is that as a supervisor, you need to evaluate students' work. So the idea here is, because we're dealing with the design component of the research project in this first unit, this assignment concentrates on the design of the research project. Okay, so the way to think about this is, if you've got a proposal in front of you, how do you then evaluate that proposal for the quality of the work? And I've given you what I'm asking you to do here is use a tool, which is it's a chapter from a book called The Reviewer's Guide to Quantitative Research. And it's well, in that book, as I think I explained in the previous session, it's a series of chapters where they focus mainly on statistical procedures, but they have a set of questions that they suggest that you ask and answer in relation to reviewing a statistical procedure, or in this case, the design of a study. So that's why this particular chapter focuses on the design of a study. So, so the principle behind this is that you're a supervisor and you need to evaluate a student's research. And what kind of tool might you be able to use to do that? So this is giving you a tool to use. So you need to be able to do the project, you need a proposal, and I'm going to share copies of proposals with you, and you can choose one of those if you don't have one of your own already. You can also use one that a student of yours has used, or you could even use your own if you've got an earlier proposal that you used that you can also use that as well, and try and evaluate it using this process. So I will provide you with some examples of proposals though. Okay, so what you need to do is examine the you need to read the chapter, obviously, and then you're going to use some of the, you don't need to use all of the criteria, you just need to use some of them. So I've listed the criteria that you need to use here. Okay, so the research design is foreshadowed and follows logically from the general problem statement and associated research questions. So what that means, so to answer that kind of, or to look for that in the proposal, the first thing you would need to do is find out whether there's a general problem statement and research questions. And we've discussed those today. So does the student have a research problem and research questions? So identify if those are there. And then does the research design follow from that problem and the associated research questions? So are they related to, are they interlinked and related and so on? And in the chapter, Daniels does give sort of examples of what you would be looking for there. So you can, if you read the chapter, you'll get more information about what you'll be looking for in terms of a problem statement and research questions. The research problem is clearly articulated and researchable. So that's something that you can sort of evaluate based on. So you look at the research problem, and then first of all, it should be identified, and then is it clearly articulated? If it's not, what's wrong with it? How could it be articulated more clearly? Is it researchable? So is it a feasible kind of study, or do you think there's problems with the scale of the study and so on? The research design is appropriate to address the research problem and is clearly articulated. So again, that's so what kind of strategy are they using, for example? Are they using a quantitative approach, a qualitative approach? Obviously, I'll be giving you quantitative examples because we want to focus on quantitative studies. Are they using an appropriate strategy, for example? Sometimes there might be, as I said, sometimes students say that they're going to do a survey, but then actually a case study might be a better option for them. Then variables, are the variables identified and operationalized? Is the sampling, instrumentation, procedures, and data analyzed detailed? Okay, so a common problem with that, often we find with students' proposals, is they don't really indicate what data analysis they're going to do, or they just say they're going to do data analysis, but they don't specify what it's going to be. So that's also, and also with the variables, have they identified what variables they're going to measure, and explain how they're going to be explain how they're going to be operationalized? Or have they left that out? And often students, you might be able to get an indication from the proposal what's going to be measured, but they don't really explain that in much detail, and they don't sort of explain how they're going to measure the variable. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So that's another area where you might be able to find weaknesses in the proposal. I had a proposal the other day where the student said they were going to be using random sampling. But if you look at the population that they're going to be studying, they can't actually do a random sample. So they're actually going to be using a convenience sampling. So look for sort of problems like that in the proposals. And then the research design is internally consistent? So is the data analysis consistent with the sampling procedure? If there's no data analysis provided, then obviously it's not going to be internally consistent. But if there is data analysis, then it should be there should be consistency between the different components. So it goes back to that thing about the chain, the links between the chain. Are the links all strong? So that's kind of what you're looking for. And then, so here again, you'd be looking for, what variables have they identified, if they've identified any. Do you think that they're suitable variables for the problem? Could there be other ways other things they might be interested in, might be relevant for them to look at? And then the last criteria is the limitations of the design are articulated. So have they listed limitations of the study? If they haven't, what could they be? If they have, are there good limitations, or there's some that they've missed out, or they're focusing on the wrong kinds of limitations? So that's so you're kind of being asked to critique a proposal using these criteria here. Okay, so yeah, so I will provide you with some proposals. I should have those to you by Monday. And I've got some, I just need to load them up. And then I just want to also look for a couple of others as well. I just want to look at the ones that I've got just to make sure that they are areas that you can identify. It's better to have a bit of a weaker proposal than a strong proposal. But usually with any proposal, you'll find some problems with it. So it's not, there will be, it's very rare to have a perfect proposal for a student. Yeah, so yeah, and then you just need to write a short introduction. You need to conduct the review based on the criteria, and then a short conclusion. Yeah, and I think, and then the marking rubric is here. So I've just done it according to the questions. So question 1 would be the first criteria. Is the research design foreshadowed and follows logically from the general problem statement and associated research questions? So have you identified the problem in the questions? And can you, so have you summarized them accurately? And have you evaluated how they relate to one another and so on? Okay, so that's the criteria there. So I think it should be, so I think if you're having problems, you can just contact me, and then but I think it's fairly, it seems, I review proposals all the time. So for me, it's a fairly straightforward activity, but it might not be for you. So if you're having problems working out what to do, then just contact me, and then we can arrange. But don't leave it too late, though. Don't leave it till a day before you're due to hand in. So start working on it. You can read the Daniels chapter. If you have any problems with that, communicate about that and so on. Yeah, but it should be fairly straightforward. And then you'd have to hand in the proposal that you've used and your report. So I need to see which proposal you've worked on in order to work out whether you've analyzed it well. Okay, does that kind of make sense?
Yes, Doc, thank you so much.
Yes, Doctor.
Okay, yeah.
Makes sense.
It might make sense now, but when you start doing it, it might not. Okay, but yeah, that's, see how it goes. See how it goes.
The instruction that you have just said, we are not relating to exactly the assignment. We'll see it when we do it.
Yeah, so I think,
Thank you.
Just read the Daniels paper first, and then just to get an idea of what is expected of each component, and then before you try and apply the questions, read that paper first, the chapter, and then sort of go back to the questions with the proposal. So read the chapter first. Yeah. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Yeah, and I'll check. I just need to do some checks to make sure the readings that I've referred to are on the system. If they're not, I'll make sure that they come on. And then I think there was somebody mentioned this. I think it's this Varpio paper. I do have that. I've got a copy of it, so I'll definitely load that up if it's not loaded up already. Okay, so we'll get that to you as well. And then obviously you don't necessarily need to read all of these things now, but just park them. You might find them use if you can't manage the all of the readings now, then just keep them so that you've got them for future reference. Some of them you might need to use now, some of them not so much. But you can decide how much. Yeah, it's up to you. You have to manage your own learning, obviously. So you can decide which ones you want to read now and which ones you're going to read later. Okay. All right. So any other questions?
Not from my side. Thank you. I'm leaving. Bye.
Okay. Thanks, Theodora. Okay. Thank you. Mtiboho.
Thank you, Doc. I see Andrea asked extra questions on the chat.
Oh, sorry, I haven't scrolled down. Sorry. Do we have to attach the? Sorry, I didn't scroll down enough. Do we have to attach proposal attachment and make reference to it? No, I think you need to. So you don't have to. I do need to see the proposal that you work with. So I see what you're saying. The word count is for the document. And I'm not sure. Let me just see. I'll check if you can submit two documents. So the word count refers to the report, not to the proposal. So that's a separate. There's two separate documents. I just need to check that you can submit two when you submit the assignment. So let me I'll talk to Lorenzo about that. If you can't submit online, then I'll just ask you to email me the proposal separately. It's just that I need to see it unless you use one of the ones I give you. And then you can just tell me that you've used that one, and then I can just look it up because I'll have a copy of it myself anyway. Yeah. Okay. So, but I do need to know which proposal you've worked on, so I can just cross-check to make sure that you've got particularly if you use one that I don't have, just to make sure that you extracting the information the way it is in the proposal. Yeah. Yep. So I'll follow up about that. Yeah.
I think maybe the length, it has to do with the report, Doc.
Yeah.
How long should it be? Should it be 100,500 words, or how long should our report be?
It's in the document. It says, I think I've given you a word count. I think there's a word count at the end, isn't there? Yeah, it's the recommended word count is 1,500 words, so it's not going to be that long. So you need to write concisely. If you go over, it's fine. If you're short, then you might be too short. The thing is, if it's a bit longer, it's fine. It's a recommended word count, but don't sort of write 6,000 words. That's too long. Okay, because you need to just be quite concise as possible about the activity. Yeah, and if you're struggling for word count because you want to put in because you're kind of being asked to summarize parts of the proposal, like the problem statement. So if you're struggling to write that, and just refer to it and just say the problem statement can be seen on page such and such of the proposal. So you can refer to that by citing the where it is in the proposal. If you're finding that you need more length but otherwise just write it a bit longer, and that's perfectly fine. You're not going to be penalized for the length. I'm not penalizing you for the length of the report in the rubric here. There's no criteria here that says the report must be exactly 1,500 words. So that's not being used for the marking. Just don't, just don't do a colleague. I remember working with a colleague once who, when he submitted his master's, it was so long that the examiner refused to mark it. So we need to avoid very, very, very long submissions. Okay.
Noted, Doc. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much, Doc. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so the answer to your question is yes, there is, but it's not strict. Okay, it's a recommendation now. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, good. All right, so let's end the session. Thank you very much. And then I'll see you. I'll meet you again in 2 weeks' time on the Thursday evening. But if you need to communicate with me, either just send an email or I'm not going to be online all the time in Moodle. So I think just if you need to communicate with me, just use my email address. If you need to communicate urgently, just use my email address. I will check into the Moodle site every now and then, but not every day. So just if you need to get hold of me urgently, just send to my work address, okay, my normal email address, which I don't think you might not have. So, but I'll arrange an email to you it should be on the system anyway, actually. So yeah. And it'll be in the handout as well, so you will be able to find it. Okay, good. Okay, so enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Good luck with you, and I hope you're going to spend the rest of the day working on this course, reading and planning your assignment 1. And good. Okay. All right, and I'll be in touch early next week, and then I will see you in 2 weeks' time online. Good. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you.
Bye, Doc. Bye.
Okay, thank you.